Hey, my name is ShawNshawN, and I have a website called ShawNshawN.co. I sell art there and specials on eBay. Today we're going to review Bolden. So Bolden's about the very first jazz player of New Orleans, basically the originator. He's born in 1877, he dies in 1907, so not a long life. It's kind of interesting because he's living in that time period that's just right after the Civil War. There's obviously a lot of, the Jim Crow's gone into effect. Yeah, it's just really interesting from that aspect. And the New Orleans is seen as kind of one of the capitals of the Deep South. It was one time considered for the capital of the Confederacy. And it was the last battle of the Confederacy when the Civil War was already over, but no one knew because the news traveled so slowly, right? And it has like Spanish, French influence with this plantation, Deep South mentality overlay. So it has this really nice, interesting cultural. And it kind of starts with, he's a little kid in a plantation, kind of a sewing factory where his mom works. He's listening to all the instruments of the factory. And later his dad is a band musician, and so he kind of learns from his dad a little bit how to play. They don't really cover that too much, but it would have been nice. And then he meets this manager, and the manager's like, oh, I can really make you sell a lot more. And he's like, well, really, how do you make that? It sounds like you're just being paid for nothing, right? He's like, no, I'll get you in front of white audiences. So he parachutes him in from the sky literally over this white audience listening to kind of this classical band music of the time with light skin black. So you have this light skin versus black skin issue as well, which is really interesting, which was a thing back in the day where if you were light skinned enough, you kind of passed as, mulatto. You weren't accepted in the white culture, but you were accepted to play in front of them, versus if you're dark, then you're like, well, that's the field, kind of that field versus house slave kind of mentality. And that kind of transitioned into post-Civil War era. So he parachutes over this band, and then he starts playing, and then he starts winning over the audience, right? And so he's playing for black audiences, and then he starts playing for white audiences, and then he has his band, and in his band he has kind of one of his childhood friends in that, and then later his childhood friend's kind of not so good as a clarinetist, and this classical clarinetist comes in, and then it's kind of a tumultuous relationship whether his friends get pushed out or not. He gets more and more paranoid over time. At the same time, you have the story of... Yeah, there's just a lot of different stories here. I mean, you have the light skin versus dark skin musicians, which is really interesting. Another way was the destruction of, he has this serious girlfriend, and she goes to Episcopalian versus he went to Lutheran or something. So there's kind of this church competition back in the day, as well as his mother, since they're in New Orleans, they still practice kind of the African religions under the cover, and then they're kind of Christian on top, but still the African underneath. And in the rest of the U.S., this has kind of disappeared by now, but then you kind of have the Caribbean culture that comes straight from Africa of, zombies, not zombies, but voodoo. So you still have the voodoo kind of nature to that, and there's like a voodoo museum in New Orleans to this day, so it's kind of interesting. You have this culture. So he has a serious girlfriend, he gets her knocked up, but then he grows in his popularity, starts sleeping with more women around town, and then... So he's destroying that relationship, so he's very self-destructive. He starts to drink and starts developing kind of a drinking habit. They don't really cover it, but supposedly he was an alcoholic in the real life, and then his mother, he became more and more delusional, and his mother put him in an institute. In the film, what they do is they take this nice kind of subplot where the manager's kind of manipulating him to get his music recorded, and the manager's working with this big white plantation owner, Judge Perry, who's also a judge. And then everything kind of falls, all the house of cards collapses, and his manager gets killed off. He ends up, being labeled set up as a murderer and put into the asylum. So that was kind of an interesting plot twist. Definitely in the realm of possibility. I don't think that's probably what happened, but it definitely gives a more edge to the story. And it's really interesting because you have kind of this time flip back and forth between when he's in the insane asylum versus his successful life up to a certain point, right? And then he gets put in the insane asylum. So I think they frame that so that you're not, go off the deep end. In the end, you're like, oh my God, this is terrible. What happened to this guy, right? So they kind of cut that back and forth. I'm not sure if that's the way I would cut the film, but it's an interesting plot device. And it's really interesting too, because at the very end, and also at the very beginning, he's hearing Louis Armstrong playing for the radio for the first time, and it actually comes on the radio, and it comes into this insane asylum, and Buddy Bolden is actually hearing his music, interpreted by Louis Armstrong being played, and he gives coots to Buddy Bolden, and then Buddy actually dies in real life 4 months after that. So it was really, quite a different, really kind of a sad story, but at the same time very successful. But yeah, it was just, the really tight-knit community and what you could and couldn't get away with being dark skin versus white skin, black in this white dominated culture. You have kind of the voodoo overlay a little bit. Has some really interesting takes. There was another weird thing. They kind of have this psychological film thing where he's kind of a dreamscape. I think it's kind of a reference to his buddy's delusions in its per se, but I don't know if it works for me. I don't think that's kind of necessary, and maybe a little bit of that, but I would scale back that a little bit. Another really interesting aspect is you have kind of this classical clarinetist enters the band, and his best friend from when he's a kid, who's kind of an okay clarinetist player, they're like this rivalry, so they show that, oh, is this guy going to take over my part? And then, Buddy's like, no, he's not taking your part, he's just sitting in a stand. And then, so everyone's kind of paranoid where they're going to lose. And obviously, in part of the film also, Buddy gets confronted by this young kid who's really good and plays almost the same style as him. And at that point, he kind of breaks down mentally. So it has all these different angles to it, as well as showing how the music really affected people to dance very sexually, sensually. How that's just totally intermixed with the music. It's a really kind of sexual dance type of music. And it wasn't seen as Christian. It was kind of the opposite of Christian band music. One thing they don't cover about Buddy is he could actually play different styles of music. So I think it would have been nice to show him playing in church. He could also play waltzes and some of the ragtime and other precursors to the jazz. So, it would have been nice to kind of see the musical evolution from his earlier style to what he developed. They did show when he kind of develops a little bit, but they kind of have like this, it's always in jazz and it's like, oh, this is a precursor, and then boom, he's there. It would have been nice to kind of show like the waltzes and of course you'd have to have the actors playing the musicians would have to learn more parts, so they'd have to be real musicians, which probably wasn't possible. I might have cut back too on some of the sex scenes. It just seemed like it was a lot to that and a little bit more distracting from the story. There's definitely that element, obviously, with playing in jazz bars and people really looking up to jazz players at the time. So I mean, you need that a little bit, but I don't know if it didn't mean that portrayed as well as much in the film. I might want to cut back some of that. Overall, I think they did a really great part. Rena Wilson playing Louis Armstrong, very believable. Gary Carr playing Buddy Bolden, really believable trumpet playing. I don't know if he played the trumpet, but he's really good. Eric LeRae Harvey as the butler, the manager, this kind of creepy guy, but still kind of working his way within society of this black-white huge disparity in the early 1900s. Ian McShane playing this ex kind of white plantation owner with his factory and really very powerful within New Orleans society. It has a lot of different characters in that. It's very interesting. Because it has kind of a tragic end to this film, I don't think it's going to be as successful. But, it is what it is. That's kind of his real life story in a way. But I think it's a really cool story to see and learn more about the jazz music. And, I'm a real big fan of jazz, or especially blues music more for myself. My wife's more into jazz. I like more Latin jazz, but it's really great. And if you ever go to New Orleans, you're just like, mwah, it's magnifico. So it has a really a lot of fun things to the film. I would just kind of cut back maybe on the psychedelic scenes a little bit, which is kind of trippy. You're like, this is in the 1900s. Why would there be psychedelic scenes, right? But they kind of shoot it that way, so it's kind of funny. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing they could do to make it kind of a happy end story because his life does end kind of tragically with kind of delusional paranoia taking over his life, and they kind of show in a different stance that maybe he was set up. So it's just kind of an interesting take on it. So, and his music was completely lost, which is really tragic because, some of his songs were maintained. People knew him and would say, oh, this was Buddy Bolden's music. But they were never, the recorded version, he did one recording, it was completely lost. You're like, oh no, the origin of jazz, the music was lost. But of course, this is the very early years of recording. So at this point, a lot of that stuff, no one knew how to preserve it, didn't know how, the value of it at the time. It was just very innovative. It was like, oh, this is interesting. Like my dub tapes, we'd record stuff with the radio, but I never thought to, take good care of it. And maybe I could have lost music that was valuable as well. But yeah, I think it's a pretty good film. Timing is really, pretty quick. It's not an hour and a half, but it's an hour and 48. You don't really feel it being too long, except maybe some of the sex scenes could have been cut back, I think, a little bit. The psychedelic part a little bit. So maybe you could cut 5 minutes out of the film, but I think the editing's pretty good. Pretty solid director with Dan Pritzker. And he also wrote the story, so it's kind of that nice, it's his story and he directed it, so you don't have that kind of disparity between the writer and the director and multiple directors, and like an Avengers film, right? You're just like, oh my god, there's like a million people in it. But yeah, this is a really solid film. I'd highly recommend it. Here's my thumbs up. Hopefully you like it. Give me a thumbs up as well. If you want to subscribe below. And I'll see you in the next movie review. Thanks for watching, guys.